Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Or good afternoon, should I say? Actually, well, for most of us, except for the most important person here, the speaker, for whom it's actually very early morning. But we'll say a few more words about that once everybody's connected. We'll wait for everybody to connect.
Hello, John. All right. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Yes, I'm very well.
Good.
I'm not really in San Francisco.
Oh, I'm disappointed.
Next week.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good.
You had me confused for a second there because the picture looked so realistic.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Good to see you. Okay, so here I am. Hello. So I suppose we'll be waiting for a couple of more minutes. Okay.
Yes, let's just wait for a few more minutes.
Okay.
So now is the time to go and grab that cup of coffee or tea or whatever it is, or lunch, since it's 12 for most of us. But we will start soon, absolutely. Well, Vincent, it looks like there aren't many people connected.
No. I'll make sure the people who actually turn up are admitted later on, but so far so good.
Yeah. Yeah, it's 2 minutes past 12 according to my mobile phone, so not on time, not very late. Well, I guess I can just say a few, just one word, one introductory remark. Welcome, everybody. We're very grateful to Charlotte Gould, who's a fellow professor of British Studies at the University of Nanterre in Paris, for having organized this session. And we're very grateful to the speaker that Charlotte had the great idea to invite, Durba Ghosh, who is a professor of history at Cornell University, no less, in the United States, and who has gotten up very early. I think it's 6 in the morning for you, Durba, at the moment. And so we're very thankful for her for her effort to participate in our seminar. And we're very, very happy to be able to benefit from her expertise and for her to accept to share, I think, ongoing research or new research that she's doing at the moment. It's great for this seminar. We're very pleased to have you, Durba. And again, thank you again, Charlotte, for organizing this. So I think I'll say no more. Vincent, if you want to add a word. Otherwise,
No.
It's up to you, Charlotte, to introduce fully the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Romain, and thank you, Vincent. We are indeed quite thrilled to welcome Durba Ghosh to the MIDIB seminar. Durba is professor at the Department of History at Cornell University, where she is the director of the Humanities Scholars Program. She's the author of 2 important books, Gentlemanly Terrorists, Political Violence and the Colonial State in India, and Sex and the Family in Colonial India, both with Cambridge University Press. I am indebted to Professor Deborah Cherry, who alerted me to a great paper that Durba had delivered at the Institute of Historical Research in London in late last year on making London historic. And this is, the presentation she's going to deliver today is something that I think quite a lot in, and I'm sure there will be a lot of interest and a lot of questions to follow. So Durba, the Zoom floor is now yours. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me, especially to you, Charlotte. So I love presenting new work to different audiences, and I think this audience is of particular interest to me because I know some of the conversations that I'll talk about are of interest in the work that you do. So I'll start by explaining, for those of you who haven't read my work, that I trained as a historian of the British Empire with particular expertise in the history of South Asia. And actually I trained at Berkeley, so I was so pleased to see that background of the Golden Gate Bridge. So thank you, John, for that. This is the more British imperial end of the project and of the interests that I have. And so I should specify that I'm not trained in British history. So if there's anything that comes up that I've gotten wrong, you should tell me in the Q&A or poke me about it. The other thing that I'll say about this by way of introduction is this is part of a larger book project that has taken an unusual detour. And in some ways it's taken a detour because I had thought I was going to do a project about post-colonial South Asia. And then for a variety of reasons, including the intervention of the pandemic, of course, I wasn't able to travel these last 2 years. So I started thinking kind of in a new direction, and I'll share, I'll do a slide PowerPoint, but then I'll come back in about 40 minutes and we can talk about the presentation. So let me just make sure you can all see the PowerPoint. Of course, I've been doing Zoom for 10,000 years, but every time I think it's not going to work. But here we go. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes. Yes.
Great. And I think when we did this yesterday, can you just see the title screen? Yeah?
Yes, it
Yeah,
works.
perfectly fine.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. So this is the book that I wrote. It came out in 2017. It was a book about revolutionary violence, revolutionary terrorist violence in British India and late colonial India. And I had planned to write about the ways that Indian revolutionary terrorists were monumentalized in post-colonial India. And so if you see here, the image that I'd used on the front cover of my book was a mass-produced lithograph that was generated in the 1940s to publicize the larger movement. It was also intended, I think, to recruit new followers. The figure in this lithograph is Khudiram Bose, and he was executed by the British in 1908 for a political assassination. His martyrdom became an important story for the movement. It's something I write about in the book. But what was interesting to me was that as a figure, he becomes a very important freedom fighter, nationalist hero, who's then monumentalized. This is the statue of Khudiram put up in 1972 in the center of Calcutta. And so I had hoped to write about the installation of these statues in post-colonial cities and across South Asia, and in particular, the moments at which they were installed. And so this statue was installed in 1972, which is the 25th anniversary celebrations of Indian independence. It also coincided with the independence of Bangladesh, which is where Khudiram was from. So there was a kind of alignment between these two moments, these two very important historical moments. So I started with this statue and particularly its location in Calcutta. I learned that the plinth had been there a long time and that before this statue was installed, there was a statue of George Eden, who's the first Earl of Auckland. And the statue that had been there had been moved to the city of Auckland, New Zealand, even though George Eden had never visited New Zealand in his lifetime. It was in following the itinerary for this statue that I became interested in the idea that statues move, right? And that statues actually moved across the empire, which is kind of counterintuitive when we think about the kind of hullabaloo and controversy that has arisen about the beheading or vandalism of colonial statues. Today, I want to turn away from Calcutta. I'll come back to Calcutta in moments, but I want to focus on the City of London and in particular, a space that is very well known as a tourist attraction, and that's Waterloo Place and Trafalgar Square, and where the colonial statues have become a bit of a lightning rod. And as a way to engage that set of debates, I want to show you today the installation of these statues as showing how London is constructed as an imperial city, but also how it's constructed as a historic city. As London became the heart of empire, commissioning public art was monumental in size and historical in content became a way that Britain's imperial history was embedded in the urban landscape. And I'll just start with one to give you a sense of the kinds of statues I'm looking at. So this is a statue by the very famous sculptor John Foley, who's a member of the Royal Academy. And he was commissioned to produce some of the most iconic statues of the Victorian Empire, including Prince Albert, who's in the Albert Memorial in South Kensington. Foley was responsible for sculpting several famous colonial officials of India, Lords Hardinge and Canning, and General James Outram, whose life-size portrait statues were placed around central Calcutta, within walking distance of the large agency houses, banking firms, and administrative offices of the East India Company. Calcutta, as many of you may know, was Britain's capital in India, was the empire's capital in India. These statues become central to the building of the city, or the kind of making of the city as capital space. I'll show you 4 versions, or not really 4 versions. It's the same statue, they're just in 4 different locations. As it moved from its primary exhibition space in the center of London, here it is on Waterloo Place. So it moved from the center of London to the center of Calcutta. It's no longer in a prominent place, but it hasn't been beheaded. So I'll let you know that up front. So this is Waterloo Place. It was first proposed by supporters of Outram after he fought successfully in the siege of Lucknow in 1857. When he returned to London in 1861, his followers insisted that a statue to him be installed in the city, and they preferred that it be installed in Trafalgar Square, where his colleagues Henry Havelock had been commemorated. This request was refused by the Office of Works, and instead 2 statues were commissioned, one by Matthew Noble, which is currently on the embankment in London, and another by John Foley, which you see here. It was displayed on this plinth for 10 years before it was moved to Calcutta. There was talk of this statue, which eventually moved to India, of bringing it back to this place in London in 1960, but that was quashed because of the cost of moving it back from India to London. Completed in 1864, what's interesting about this statue is the very much alive James Outram sat for the statue in front of John Foley before he went to France, where he died. And so one of the things that art critics noticed was the very strong resemblance of the actual figure. In August 1873, the Illustrated London News reported that the statue was about to leave London and this very prominent place, and it was going to be moved to the capital city of the British Empire in India, which was Calcutta, and it would be installed at the important corner of Chowringhee and Park Street, opposite the Asiatic Society, which had been founded in the 18th century. The writer for the Illustrated London News bemoaned a sense of loss, noting, quote, "We cannot but regret a work which would go far to redeem the character of our public monuments should be lost to this country," close quote. This writer called for a replica, but acknowledged that a smaller copy of the statue wouldn't have the same effect on the public. Because the horse is in motion, I'll just say that that was one of the kind of artistic accomplishments. And I won't have time to talk about that part of it, but I'm happy to come back in the Q&A. When the statue was unveiled in 1974 in India, it was situated at the border of the Maidan. And here it is in Calcutta. And you can see back in the distance at the bottom of the plinth, you can see all the quote unquote white palaces that border Chowringhee, which is the kind of main street of Calcutta. You can see that it was an important thoroughfare. You can also see that there's a kind of uniformity to those buildings because they're all built in the kind of Georgian and early Victorian era. I'll show you some of the other monuments that are on this screen, including this one of Lord Hardinge, also on a horse. He's also sculpted by John Foley. And so the reason I'm just picking on John Foley, I'll just say, is that the artists became known for these statues and that their style became replicated across the various cities of the empire. So if you look up John Foley, you'll see he has statues across the British Empire, in Dublin, in Birmingham, and so on. This one, you can see, makes clear what the scale of the statues were, that they were meant to overwhelm walkers by. And in the corner here on the right, you see the Ochterlony Monument. Harding was a hero of the Anglo-Sikh campaigns of 1846. He served as commander-in-chief in Crimea. And you can see that the idea is that he towers over the people that are standing there. And of course, the two passersby would probably have been people who worked in the photographer's studio. And they're there partially to give you a sense of the scale of the statue. Because I work on Calcutta and I've lived there for long periods of time, I can say a great deal about the city. So you should ask me in the Q&A. Many of the buildings, I'll just say, are constructed, and you see them here in the background, between the 1780s and 1920s. They're intended to show the monumentality and the permanence of the British Empire. And of course, my PhD supervisor, Thomas Metcalfe, wrote a book about this, and in particular, the architecture of the empire. There was not a city before the British arrived. It was 3 villages. And the establishment of the British capital there is very much a part of the city's identity, as are these monuments. As it became the capital of the British Empire, Calcutta attracted many colonial monuments that commemorate British figures. And nearly all of these monuments, and you see them here, are commissioned in Britain and moved to sites in Asia. I'm just going to grab a tissue. So I want to just turn to this story in particular of what happens to these statues as India becomes independent. And one of the big key dates here is 1957, which is the 10th anniversary of Indian independence. It's also the century anniversary of the Indian Mutiny. And so statues like this become very controversial in 1957. And one of the things that happens in India is that there are calls across India to remove these statues from public places. And in Britain, the response is that there are groups of formerly returned colonial officials who advocate to have these statues moved back to Britain. This is an enormous cost, and I won't go into the drama that happens, but I will just say that this statue is actually moved. This is the Outram statue. The Outram statue is moved. You can see the kind of technological prowess that would have needed to happen to move these statues. The Outram statues eventually moved to the Calcutta Victoria Memorial, and here you see that it's in a garden, maybe not so nearly as prominent. And the Harding statue, which I showed you a minute ago, is actually moved to the backyard of a member of the Harding family, and then eventually moved to another site. And here you can see, of course, it's bronze, it's been in the elements, it's off the plinth. It has a very different effect, right? So just to give you an idea of what this movement might have looked like. So with this kind of long preamble, let me just concretize through the itinerary of these monuments, 2 of the arguments for the project. So one is I'm thinking about how the city and the emergent spaces of urban modernity were shaped by public art. And I'm interested in the use of public art in the building of cities, particularly the city of Calcutta, which I won't focus on today. But I'm interested in thinking about how the city of London has a kind of parallel, a shadow, or a double. When London became the heart of empire in the same years that Calcutta emerged as the capital city of British India. So I very much want to put Calcutta and London in the same kind of time frame. Second, in light of recent debates and controversies about colonial statues and their removal, I conceive of the project as historicizing why so many statues cropped up across the long 19th century. In Britain and its empire, hundreds of statues were commissioned. They were placed in emerging cities from provincial sites like Birmingham, Bristol, Dublin, Edinburgh, York, and in major cities like London, which I'll talk about today. In the Indian dominions between the British occupation of India in the 19th century and decolonization in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the installation or the existence of these statues projected the material proof of the permanence of the British Empire. This vision of permanence might make us think that the statues could never be moved, except they were always being moved. Few statues were ever actually made in the Indian subcontinent. And one of the things I will focus on in the longer project is the ways that that the movement of these statues in the 19th century showcased the technological advantages the British had. So one was the ability to melt these metals and forge them into statues, as well as the ability to transport them across oceans and railways. These statues weigh many tons. And one of the things I learned that when the issue of moving them back comes up, the cost is the big obstacle. And the cost is actually pretty significant. So I want to think of these two processes together, the building of cities and the installation of monuments. And I want to also think about how public art became a way to tell public history. So as public art was mobilized to educating the public about its history, I just want to draw attention to the different publics. In Calcutta, colonial statues made the British involvement in India's history visible to Indians. It also made it appear permanent. They had always been there and they planned to stay for a long time. In Britain, these colonial monuments become ways of educating Britain's visitors to London and tourists about about Britain's overseas activities. In this way, imperial wars were materialized in the heart of the city through figurative statues that exhibited the men who had been responsible for the defense of a growing empire. Framed in this way, 19th century public art was more than commemorative. It was meant to be pedagogical, and that pedagogy was materialized through bronze, marble, and stone. Obviously, for those of you who know your British imperial history, I'm drawing from the work of John Mackenzie and the various volumes of studies in empire. I'll also just give a shout out to Felix Driver and David Gilbert's Imperial Cities, and Bernie Sebe's book, Heroic Imperialists in Africa, the promotion of British and French imperial heroes. I want to turn now to Waterloo Place, which is a kind of important site. It's probably a site that if you've been in London, you've walked down and you probably haven't even thought of it as a particular kind of space. It's the road that connects Piccadilly Circus to the mall, and it's on a slight incline. Some of you, it looks like you might know what it is. It's a road that is entirely made after Britain's victories over France in 1815, hence the name Waterloo Place. Various groups proposed commemorations of historical figures around London in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, and a committee of national monuments, also called the Committee of Taste, is set up in 1802. It included connoisseurs and collectors of art who hoped to convey Britain's history through objects such as funerary monuments, tablets, and historical markers. This process is supplemented by a series of commemorations at St. Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey. The involvement of these various groups means that political, religious, and commercial leaders are celebrated, as well as members of the royal family. And so all of these groups come together to, quote, invest in the pedagogical power of national monuments, as Holger Hoek has noted in his book, Empires of Imagination. In the relatively peaceful period between 1815 and the start of the Crimean Wars in the 1850s, the city of London developed an urban aesthetic that depended on building monumental architecture. And I won't go into that in detail. Probably a lot of you who are urban historians know that London was accommodated by wider roads, plazas, and squares. And in part, large parts of London are rebuilt and remade, especially Regent Street. Buildings like the Royal Academy are made to seem larger, the National Gallery, the British Museum, the British Library. And later on in the 19th century, of course, the building of South Kensington and the World, which come about as the result of the World Exhibitions. And so all of this monumentalizing is accompanied by the installation of large public sculptures in these newly devised public spaces. The increase in public monuments results in the 1854 Monuments Act that specified where monuments might be installed and who would have foresight over or oversight over these monuments. They were governed by different political units, and so the installation of a statue involved numerous municipal groups and civic associations. And so I'll just list a few. The London City Council, the cities of London and Westminster, and the County of Middlesex oversee the installation and maintenance of memorials and statues. Another key actor, and I'll just put that out there, is the Crown. So the Crown land and estates own large parts of London, and the process of putting statues in the Crown estates is different than these other spaces. As requests to install statues and memorials proliferated in the 19th century, the Department of Public Works becomes much more important. And so in some sense, the installation of public art is seen to be in the purview of the public and seen to be in the purview of the government. In the first part of the 19th century, Trafalgar Square, Waterloo Place, and Pall Mall were redesigned. By the end of the 19th century, all of these paths are much larger. And some of that, I'll just tell you, is precipitated by the Queen's Jubilee first in 1887, then in 1897. And there's a sense that the Queen ought to be able to process from Buckingham Palace to Trafalgar Square with some grandeur. And so those processions that we now see every time somebody gets married are a result of this kind of respatializing of London. The redesign of central London generated a kind of aesthetic unity, and Trafalgar Square in particular, which had been a kind of civic meeting place in the medieval period, was enlarged, and it was connected. It connected the different parts of the city east to west and to Buckingham Palace. In these expansions, the statues that go in Trafalgar Square become a subject of public conversation. So the first round of these statues are placed in the 1850s after the mutiny. And I'll just show you a slide of some of these statues. This is Captain Cook on the left, John Franklin in the middle. They're both obviously British explorers who had quote unquote discovered Polynesia and the Arctic. On the right, you see, this is Henry Havelock, and he's obviously installed in Waterloo Place. And these statues, of course, public art, all done by sculptors of the Royal Academy. They're all exhibited as art at the Academy, and then they are installed in the spaces in which they are now. I'll just show you a map of this area so you can get a sense of just how many statues are clustered there. They're installed in just a few decades, from around 1860 to the 1890s. They materialize the colonial expansion of territories by placing the monuments in the center of the city along with explanatory tablets on the plinths. Perhaps one of the things I want to focus on today is they didn't randomly go up, which is often the explanation. They were carefully curated, and they were carefully curated because you can see in the correspondence of the Office of Public Works that they chose who went in these places. So on this map, if you walk down from Piccadilly Circus down Waterloo Place, the first monuments you'll see is a monument to the British war in Crimea. The central figures there were installed in 1861, and in 1914, the monument was moved 30 feet to the north to make room for the statues that are on either side of it, Florence Nightingale on the left and a statue of Sidney Herbert. The statue of Sidney Herbert on the right had been outside the War Office in Pall Mall, but then it was moved here in 1914 so that it would kind of offer a counterpoint to Florence Nightingale. The grouping of the Crimean War is followed, actually, if you continue further down the hill, and you can see that there actually was nothing further down the hill, and people wrote about the vistas to the Duke of York column. But further down the hill, oh, sorry, I think I missed the further down the hill. Let me show you. Further down the hill, you see this is Edward VII, and I'll come back to this in a minute. If a crow flew over this line of monuments, they'd see a row of historical figures that linked Britain's 19th century imperial wars and territorial expansion. In comparison to how these statues are situated in Calcutta, which are a form of occupation, these statues in London are a way to remind and rematerialize the empire in the growth of the modern city. The military heroes of Waterloo Place, Campbell, Napier, Lawrence, might be seen as companions to the statues of Napier and Henry Havelock that are installed in Trafalgar Square. I'll start by talking about this statue. This is Colin Campbell. He's a kind of hero of the 1857 mutiny. He's sculpted by Carlo Maraschetti, who is a much favored sculptor of the Queen. Maybe the reason I'll just emphasize this is that you see here, this is a very elaborate statue, Colin Campbell on this kind of column, but also Britannia at the bottom on a lion, right? It's obviously meant to be very grand. It's meant to be very monumental. You see it's also an echo of the Angel of Cawnpore, which was meant to be the funerary monument that marked the massacre at Cawnpore, which took place in 1857. And so here you see in the Angel on the right, also done by Maraschetti, that there is a kind of classical aesthetic that's being replicated. And in fact, one of the things that visitors to the Cawnpore massacre said, British visitors, because there were these mutiny tours and guidebooks that directed British tourists to mutiny monuments in India, they all said how much the image on the right reminded them of the image on the left in London. In these photographs, you can see how much these monuments were endlessly photographed, so tourists knew what to look for when they traveled. I'll just show you another replica, and here you can see this is Napier, Robert Napier, another hero, another war hero. Here he is on the plinth that Outram was on. And so if you remember, I told you Outram moved quite a bit, but the plinth stayed, and the plinth held this Napier. The plinth then went on to hold Edward VII. This is a McKennell statue. I won't have time to talk about it today, but this McKennell statue also exists in Bombay, and that statue was moved to Toronto in 1969. So just to restate, these are very large statues that are being replicated and moved in the period of colonial expansion. Maybe just one more. This is Napier, who I just showed you. Napier on the left, this is the image in Calcutta. You can see it's the Lord Napier statue. On the plinth here, it says Napier of Magdala, which was one of his victories. Of course, in Britain, he's represented as a military hero of India. On the right, you see that Napier statue that was in London. It was moved from Waterloo Place in order to make way for Edward VII. This statue is currently at Queensgate, also in South, I think, which is in South Kensington. One thing I'll just say is, if you look, he stands on the horse stands on a plinth that has a little bit of a rise, right? It was a kind of artistic strategy to give the rider's posture a bit more grandeur, right? You could be a little bit more upright. It would make you look taller. So here are the three statues, the same plinths, just to give you a sense of how this location becomes a very important location for showcasing the history of Britain and its empire. Located in the center of London, the plinth became a kind of platform, literally a platform for these statues. These statues move across oceans. They also move across the city, but they mean different things in different sites. Although each statue was credited to a particular sculptor and their style, the statues are often replicated, which meant that when visitors went from one imperial city to another, they would recognize the visual uniformities across these different imperial sites. I'm just looking at the time, and I'm going to show you one statue whose replication I find fascinating. This is John Lawrence. He stands at Waterloo Place, and this statue by Joseph Bem is a replica, and the other one is in Lahore. So John Lawrence, a fairly important figure. He's Viceroy of India after a career in the northwestern part of India. He's responsible for the conquest of Punjab, after which he is given various positions, and he eventually dies when he returns to England. The monument is installed in 1882. And perhaps one of the things that's most interesting about the statue is that it's commissioned from the Royal Academy by this sculptor, Joseph Bem. It's paid for by donations raised by colleagues and friends of Lawrence. And there's a tablet which tells you a little bit about his career. John Lawrence's family really didn't like the statue, and Bam, the sculptor who had been commissioned to do it, said, okay, well, I agree. I don't like it either. And instead, the original statue, which was in London, was shipped to Lahore. In 1957, as Pakistan celebrates its 10th anniversary, there's a call to remove the statue. And in part, it's because the Pakistani government fears that the statue will be vandalized. The statue at that point is moved to Northern Ireland, and you see it here on the right, where it was installed in a school. Northern Ireland, some of you may not be surprised to hear, became the recipient of several of these colonial statues in the 1950s and 1960s, obviously as a way to consolidate its loyalties to the British Empire. Lawrence's ancestors had been from Ulster County, and so this seemed like a good way to remind the Irish about their imperial legacies. When Lawrence, when Lawrence was moved to Northern Ireland, one of the things that I'll just say, and I'll return back to this one, his family noted that they had never really wanted the statue put up. And they were ambivalent about their ancestors' place in the empire. And so what's interesting about this statue is it's actually the second version of the original statue. Now there's another one outside of Dublin that looks exactly like this. So I want to start to wrap up. And in wrapping up, I guess one of the things I'll start to say, and it's partially wrapping up, but also opening of a new conversation. Over the span of the 19th century, the spaces of central London that we identify as quintessential to the tourist experience and parts of the historic London we should visit became populated with memorials, monuments, statues, and markers as a way of reminding and educating those who pass by, often on foot, of the historical importance of the city as an empire. In this way, it's critical to see how London was made into a historic city and how that history was made visible. I've shown you how colonial statues circulated around the empire, but so did the names of many of these men as new colonial cities were settled. Now I've shown you Charles Napier, who was an important figure in the battle to win the Punjab. He became the namesake of the newly formed seaport on North Island in New Zealand that had been acquired by the Crown to enable the shipment of wool out of New Zealand. And this is a map of Napier, New Zealand today. And I've put some arrows to give you a sense of how these mutiny names, remember the mutinies fought in India, how these mutiny names crop up in New Zealand. So it's part of my research plan to go to New Zealand to research how this happened. We'll see if that transpires. Napier, importantly, had never been to New Zealand, nor had Outram, who has an Outram Street, or Harding, yet they all had streets named after them several oceans away. Outram has a cot or a dock named after him in Calcutta. He also has streets named after him in Singapore and in Toronto, all of which were colonies that he never went to. These were ways that colonies proved their loyalty to the British Empire, particularly during the Mutiny, as the British Empire's biggest colony was revolting. With the use of street and town names, the commemoration of British military heroes linked different historical moments to the urban spaces that were emerging around the empire, particularly here, as you can see, in the Pacific Ocean. Henry Havelock, who died in the Siege of Lucknow, has at least 8 cities named after him, including a city in North Carolina. Havelock, New Zealand, and I'll show you, this is Havelock, New Zealand. Havelock, New Zealand has a Lucknow Street as its main thoroughfare. Havelock Island, the seemingly unspoiled tourist attraction in the Andaman Islands, has recently been renamed, and in December 2018, it was renamed Swaraj Deep by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And he, of course, reminded Indians that we no longer needed to commemorate the 1857 mutiny in modern India. As martial figures cropped up in the form of statues, their names were repeatedly used to settle the urban spaces of the British Empire. Perhaps most notably, of course, Havelock Road in Southall has been renamed in honor of the founder of the Sikh faith, Guru Nanak Road. I'll just show you, this is, I know some of you have been following the disastrous royal tour in Jamaica, but here we have Prince Charles at the renaming of Havelock Road. I want to turn in the final minutes to a novel. Oh, sorry, I'm going to just say another word about London, which is that, of course, I want to turn in a slightly tangential way to a novel that I love, Amitav Ghosh's novel, The Shadow Lines, and his experience of walking through London and feeling that he had been there before. In the novel, the narrator, quote, who had never been more than 100 miles from Calcutta, recalls feeling irritated with his cousin Ela, who at the same time had lived as an expatriate life and experienced other places, quote, as a worldwide string of departure lounges. This narrator talks about the experience as somebody who's a colonized subject visiting London. And so when he arrives in London, as many former colonial subjects did, they felt they had been there before. One of the things I'll just draw attention to, of course, is that this was a very deliberate measure. And these are the blue plaques, and I'll just show you a few of them. There's over 900 of them. There's actually a whole website, and there's an app. But one of the things you can't help but notice is how London is made historical. And here, this is a kind of spatial marking of the city about who lived in these spaces and what years. These are all people with some kind of Indian background. Arriving in London was a reminder that you weren't the first Indian to travel across London. Here you could see your ancestors in different forms. The idea of historic London is so deeply embedded that one might imagine that being historical and imperial was an accidental development. London is an old city, and that's why it appears old. Britain had an empire, and that's why its capital city became the heart of empire. However, one of the things I want to argue is that, as several generations of scholars have shown, the idea of London as historic as imperial emerged in the Victorian era as a way to solidify why the city was distinctive in comparison to other cities. And of course, the city that Londoners compare themselves the most is Paris. These changes in London's image necessitated changes in public sculpture. And so one of the things I want to make an argument for is one of the interesting things that's happened in London is, of course, thinking more concretely about public sculpture and what it represents. As Andrea Zemgulis has noted, the modernist city developed in relation to heritage sites in London, in relation to a city that was elaborately constructed as a place preserving the past. And in that preservation, you see that blue plaques like this were a way to remind people of the historic city. For writers such as Amitav Ghosh, and this is one of my favorite novels, the history of London's neighborhoods was intertwined with the post-colonial history of the families who are brought together by colonial activity. So in this novel, if you haven't heard, there are two families that come together. The family of Lionel Tresauwen, who's the patriarch to the Price family. Tresauwen founded a factory in Barrackpore outside Calcutta after a career working for mining companies in Malaysia, Fiji, Bolivia, and Sri Lanka. In Tresauwen's travels through Britain's imperial holdings, he becomes attached to the Theosophical Society. And through that encounter, he becomes attached, or he befriends Judge Chandrasekhar Dutta Chowdhury, who becomes the patriarch of the extended family that connects Ghosh's Indian characters to Ghosh's Ghosh's British characters. In Shadow Lines, the city of Calcutta is London's double. When the narrator looks up at the smoggy night sky above Gould Park, as he calls it, he thinks of London's nightscape. As he leaves London, he writes this paragraph, which I've put there. He walks along the embankment from Trafalgar Square to see his cousin Ela. He walks this path many times in the novel, and he pauses at Trafalgar Square. He suggests that he meet his cousin in front of St. Martin's in the square, and she mocks him as being trite, as an image that would appear in a bad film, as something that tourists would do. As he waits for her to arrive, he thinks about this, and he observes the tourists and pigeons and the fountains, the stone lions that mark the space between the National Gallery of Art and Nelson's column. It's in that moment that you see that this post-colonial subject sees the city of London as old, as historic, as always having been there in this form. In this way, the cities of the British Empire, like Calcutta, seem that they had always existed in the form that they had been and that they had always been linked. The language of historic preservation evades the way that many of these spaces were relatively recent constructions. And so if you remember that statue of Edward VII that I showed you in Waterloo Place, I would remind you that it was only installed in 1922. In one telling, we might productively see London as a sculpture park. In another telling, we might imagine that it's time to actively curate statues and their place in the city for new publics. In the discussions that have followed this question about monument preservation versus monument destruction, also, I just want to gesture to the naming and renaming of street names. There's a sense that the existing condition of the city emerged organically and that these monuments were randomly placed. I hope that you can see that these monuments were not randomly placed, that in fact they were actively placed, and that there was a set of municipal conversations that went into putting the monuments where they were. In simpler terms, when post-colonial populations demand that statues come down, they're often treated or perceived as violating some universal understanding that urban planning and public art are separate domains. I would argue that we should think about these together and think concretely about how urban spaces were constructed as a form of historical pedagogy, and that this historical pedagogy might be retold. So I'll end with where I began. And I told you about that statue of Khudiram Bose, that plinth that had a statue of Lord Auckland. Here is Lord Auckland, not on a plinth any longer, now relocated to the city of Auckland in New Zealand. I'll remind you, Auckland actually never went to New Zealand, but the city is named after him to honor the legacy of the British Empire in New Zealand. This statue at pedestrian height, I think, has a very different effect. And so I'll leave you with that as a kind of image to open the Q&A.
Thank you so very much, Durba. This was really fantastic. Thanks so much. You're giving us so much perspective here with this idea of traveling statues, which is really not something that has been part of that recent discussion around statues and their removal and everything that happened in the wake of the BLM movement. And of course, well, the remark that Boris Johnson had made comes to mind, this idea that if you're removing all the statues, you're lying about history. And so, yes,
I know.
this idea of lying, and that question, of course, of the place where you find that statue, and then the moment also when it's erected, it tells us so much about that history. So thank you so very much for all this. I have just two very quick questions, but of course we're going to take questions from the people attending. The first one is, will you be looking into all the audits that different London councils have been doing on the statues that are present now, and maybe the new types of commissioning that is being done now, thinking of the different monuments, the Windrush generation that have actually already started to appear in I'm thinking of Southwark and other areas in
it's a little overwhelming, right? Since George Floyd, the reconsideration. I'll start by saying I've done a lot of this research before the pandemic. So the last round of research I did was in January 2020. And what is interesting is that the London City Council and the Office of Public Works actually do a huge survey. I want to say it's in 1952, or it goes from 1952 to 1954, because there are all these returning colonials who say, we want to have a statue of X or Y in the city. And so they do a survey. And of course, it's a very British survey. They have like A places, B places, and C places. And they're ranked according to how public they are. And then who owns them is also kind of specified in the 50s. I don't think I can do the stuff that's happened since George Floyd. I am, however, not because I expected to, I am going to research how the Crown Estates negotiate their statuary, because it turns out that, and there's a parallel in the book. So Prince Edward VII, it's not accidental that I focused on him. Until this Prince of Wales, he's the longest serving Prince of Wales, and he travels around to the various dominions, right? And I don't know if you remember the story about him. He's a little dissolute. He's not that reliable. So he's always being sent off to the empire to do these royal tours. He photographs, he has photograph albums, which are on the Royal Collection Trust, which are digitized, which are amazing because they photograph all these monuments. And he's always going to visit these monuments, unveiling them, putting on new plans. So when he becomes king and then he dies 10 years later, there's an explosion of monuments to him, right? So he's a kind of interesting figure. And Prince Charles kind of models himself after this, right? Because he now has become the longest serving Prince of Wales. And he becomes very deeply invested, interestingly, with Camilla about the defense and protection of statues, right? And so under Prince Charles, there's been I don't know if a separation. I would say in the 1850s, there's some agreement between the Office of Public Works and the Crown Estates. Recently, I would say there's been a splitting off. And where there's been a couple of new monuments put up by the Crown Estates that have been driven mainly by appeals to Prince Charles. And the one that I'll tell you about is the Bali bombings. I don't know if any of you know what that statue looks like. If you give me a minute, I can find it. It's right next, if you know the Lord Clive statue, which is also a replica, there's one in Calcutta. The Lord Clive statue has at the bottom of it a statue, a memorial to the victims of the Bali bombings. And so nobody in the government wanted that memorial, but Prince Charles did. And so he's put it there. So I'm going to focus on those kinds of moments, I think.
This is fascinating. Will you be doing any comparisons with other? So you mentioned Paris, of course, and because this is a French seminar, we'll also be interested on your take on
Well, I think I think the French example is fascinating, right? I mean, it's obviously very much tied to the revolution, right? And it's very much tied to questions of sovereignty, right? Which I think the questions in France around how the state takes control of its monuments is something that really shapes how post-colonial governments think about these monuments, right? And so I gave you the example of the Lawrence statue in Pakistan. You know, what's fascinating about Pakistan and India after independence is that the governments don't really care about the statues, but they know that they cannot release the statues back to the UK, right? So that keeping the statues, destroying them or protecting them is very important to how they establish their authority and sovereignty. And that's very much like revolutionary France, right? So they don't have a lot of resources. They don't have a lot of time. They don't really want to deal with it, is how I read the diplomatic conversations, right? But they know it's a problem, right? And so that statue of Lawrence is interesting because it doesn't actually stay in the Lahore fort where it's fairly safe. There's not that much public. They actually remove it to a warehouse so that it's not so public, and it sits in the warehouse for about 5 years before this school in Dublin comes up with the money. And actually, the interesting thing about that is the city of Dublin puts in a big amount of the money to transport it. And the P&O shipping, which has been in the news, right? They provide transportation for free for all of those statues. So there's clearly some kind of conversation about sovereignty going on, right? Through these statues, right?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Is it in Algiers where they have this statue that has been covered in a sort of concrete hulk rather than store it or or simply destroy it? They've been quite deft at finding different ways that
absolutely.
Make sure I mean that this could be maybe used at a later time. And it's, I mean, it's fascinating, right? It's like once you start thinking about it, you think, okay, that's. But thank you for those questions. We're going to take questions from the floor if there are any. Yes, Romain.
Yes. Thank you, Charlotte. Can everybody hear me? Yes, I think yes. My mic is on. Well, thank you so much, Durba, for this fascinating presentation and the opening remarks. I mean, your whole talk about the statues, the history of the statues, the traveling of statues, and then your opening remarks and your ideas about looking at street names and street renaming, and what you said about New Zealand and about this this novel, Shadow Lines, I thought was fascinating and just opened up a variety of questions in my mind, which are quite novel to me, but it was very stimulating. And just one very simple, concrete question that I thought of, both because of what you said about New Zealand and what you said about the novel. Are there actually, to your knowledge, are there also names of former Indian British colonial rulers of the Raj in other colonies, in other former British colonies today, in which there still are actually substantial Indian populations or populations of Indian origin? For example, the Fiji Islands or a lot of the Caribbean nations, Trinidad and Tobago, for example. Do they also have statues or streets with names of the former British rulers of India? And how does that play out in the political and political conversation and conversation on urban planning in those countries?
Oh gosh, yeah, there are. Actually, I've been reading around it. I haven't done that much research. I'm just going to put in the chat a book that I've been reading about novels and literary heritage. So this is, I call this the Blue Plaque book. And so it's basically about how London becomes a kind of space that you go to visit to kind of meet the authors of the novels that you've read. And so I think I want to say it's 3, Forster, right? And Howard's End, something by T.S. Eliot, and then Virginia Woolf's Night and Day and Mrs. Dalloway. And so if you're interested in novels, it's a worth book reading because it's also very historically minded, but it's a fascinating account about how these literary tours, like visiting the the house of your famous author, right? Dickens becomes an obsession for a lot of people, right? Because Dickens's novels are very spatial, very London-centered. But then the idea is you walk around London and you relive the life of the city, right? Which I think is important. But your other question, so I've been reading around this, and I think it's more true in Barbados for some reason. So not necessarily the places where they're diaspora. I haven't looked at Fiji and Mauritius. Actually, I'll tell you why I focused in on New Zealand is because you probably all know that New Zealand, that the Maori have a treaty with the Pakeha, the colonizers, and the treaty is signed in 1837 or 1838. But that really it then follows several decades of the white settlers trying to kind of overcome the Maori, right? Australia has a different story where the Aboriginals are completely overrun, right? So the naming of these streets and spaces is a little bit kind of, I don't know, aspirational, right? It's a way of, I don't think that the Fiji Mauritius, I don't think they're as aspirational as settler colonies in the same way, if that makes sense, right?
Right.
Whereas Cape Town has these names, right? So it's the white settler colonies that tend to adopt these mutiny names.
It's the white settlers colony, yes.
Yeah, and I think I think it's the book project will be from the late 18th century to the 1870s. I think if my theory about that holds up, that would explain why Dublin accepts so many of these statues in the post-colonial period, right? As the troubles are heating up, right? So most of those transfers happen in the kind of preamble to the troubles. Right. So having the colonial statue is a way of showcasing your kind of attachment to the empire.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, sure.
Does that make sense? But I thank you for raising that. I'm going to look it up because obviously for my theory to hold, I need to have that part in place.
Sure. Thanks a lot. But yeah, I think Miriam Jacobi had said on the chat box already that in South Africa, perhaps there is a big white population. It's a white, in a way, it's a white settler kind of service. That's where you can find this kind of.
Yeah. And not to get too much into South Africa, Cape Town is always talked about as the liberals, right? The Cape Town liberals are kind of better than the Afrikaners in Durban and Johannesburg and so on, right? But Cape Town is at the heart of this imperial elaboration.
Okay. Thank you.
I think we have a question from
Benedict, yes, who knows South Africa quite well. Benedict.
Yeah.
My question, and thank you so much for this talk. It was really fascinating. My question had to do with touring and tourism. I was wondering, you said that these photos were endlessly photographs. I was wondering if you had a look at some of the material culture around those photographs, things like Victorian dioramas of cities that were only the statues, for example, or were they very popular as little souvenir books for the tourists? Or
absolutely,
they're moving back and forth between India and Britain as postcards or things like
postcards.
That.
Yes, all of that. So postcards on eBay is how I found a lot of these monuments, and then they really are endlessly photographed. So big part was postcards, and in fact, I wrote a piece. Maybe I'll find you this about the Rhodes Memorial in Cape Town, which the horse, which is called Physical Energy in Cape Town, is presumed to represent Rhodes, but it's also been replicated. It's in Kensington Gardens, where it's considered a piece of art. So it's not attached to Rhodes. And what's interesting is the Office of Works is asked 4 times whether they would be willing to find a place for a statue of Rhodes in the City of London, and they refuse all 4 times. But there is this replica of a statue that's not technically Rhodes, presumed to be Rhodes in London. So what's interesting is that the postcards of public art circulate even when they are not technically of a figure, right? If that makes sense. The dioramas are very, very important, but the India office collections have endless private papers of photo albums that people kept of their travels. And in that, it's amazing how many people have these photographs of monuments in their personal photo albums that they then donated to. The other thing I'll just say is there's a wonderful book by Zahid Chaudhry called After Image of Empire, and he's done a fascinating chapter about mutiny photographs. And there are many, many mutiny photographs, but they're all of sites in ruin as a way of showing the destruction of a lot of these ancient sites by the British and the kind of conquest. But one of the photographers, very well known, Felice Beato, apparently curated them. So some of them have like skulls in them and various kinds of human bones in the foreground. And it's become clear that Beato, who went 2 years later, a year and a half later after the mutiny was over, that he curated these photographs as a form of historical documentation, even though he wasn't actually there in the moment that the mutiny happened. The mutiny tours, there's a wonderful article by Manu Goswami in the Journal of Historical Geography about the mutiny tours, and that part of the remaking of Britain's relationship with India after 1857 has to do with encouraging people to travel to India to all of these monumental sites. And so then people are writing home in their letters that we've just been to the memorial in Kanpur where the massacre occurred. We've just been to the Delhi Gate, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's very much part of the tour. Yeah. Another piece, not to get too far afield, I've been trying to figure out the unveiling of statues becomes a big media event. And so especially with the advent of film, if you go on that British Pathé website and you do unveiling statues, you'll see you get hundreds of hits. And so that also becomes a thing, right? The public spectacle of unveiling the statue. And that's a more modern thing. I haven't quite figured out when exactly that starts to happen, but that's obviously easier to show once you have film, once you have moving pictures, right?
Thank you.
Thank you. Miriam has a question as well.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for your fascinating paper. I was really interested in what you said about the pedagogical role of these statues, and in relation to the British public in particular. You mentioned the work of John Mackenzie, so I was wondering if you could say a bit more about whether or not you think that these statues, helped foster a real sense of an imperial identity in Britain and across classes, because it made me think about of the debate between Porter and Mackenzie. Was there this imperial culture or not? So would you definitely agree with John Mackenzie to say that there was indeed this imperial culture across classes in Britain, and that these statues played a role in that, just like newspapers or storybooks for children and other things?
Yeah, and so I'm more in the Mackenzie camp than the Porter camp, so I'll put that out there. Do they make an impression? That's been the hardest question to answer in the project writ large, is what effect do statues have on the people that pass by, right? So I grew up in New York City where there are so many statues, right? And actually I work on a campus now. I work at Cornell. We have a brand, right? And our brand, our logo, right? Everybody has a brand, but our logo comes from the founders, Ezra Cornell and A.D. White. And there are these two statues in the arts quad that face each other. And the students have various narratives about the two statues. They're on a plant and you're not supposed to climb on them, but of course people do climb on them now on Instagram land, right? That's the big thing, is you take a selfie of yourself on top of Ezra Cornell's head and, post at midnight or whatever. But you know, when we have visitors, you know, they do these tours, people stand outside and they take pictures of them. But what's interesting, of course, is I've been, you know, because I work here, right? I don't think I still know. There are two statues, two men. I don't know which one is Ezra Cornell, which one is A.D. White. And I doubt that most of them do, right? But part of the arguments, especially since George Floyd and the statue in Bristol, right, being taken down, part of the testimonies that we've heard over and over again is the effect that this has on people who pass by, right? This statue of this tall white man on a horse is really demoralizing for me. It's affecting to me. It doesn't make me feel like I belong, all of those things. I think that is such a hard thing to measure historically, right? Like I don't have a sense of what somebody in the 19th century in London would have experienced, right? Walking by those statues. So but I do know that the people who commissioned these statues were very obsessed with who would see these statues and what street they had to be on. So a lot of the correspondence in the Office of Public Works are the followers of these people saying, we don't want our statue on Carlton Place. We want it on Waterloo Place. We want it on Trafalgar Square. We want it to be in a prominent place, right? So the people who commissioned these statues clearly think there is a value to having them placed where they were, right? What effect it had on people that were walking by, I'm not 100% sure, right? I think that the interesting thing about that part of London, right, or at least what I've heard, what I've read about it in the, you know, whatever, in the many, you know, the books that there are about London, is that on the one hand, this was settling the central part of London and making it more hospitable to visitors and tourists, right? It made it into a kind of shopping area, right? And in that way, it democratized these spaces. The shop fronts had big open windows after a time. They were meant to be spaces where you perambulated. By the late 19th century, they're places where women are allowed to come unaccompanied and kind of walk and shop and so on. What effect these statues were meant to have, I'm not really sure. What's quite striking is that it's really not until the 20th century that the statues are permanently located where they are, right? That in fact, the statues are kind of moving, you know, and the one that I showed you, the Outram statue, is an example of that, right? The other thing that I would say is, and I think this will be part of the argument if I'm hoping to get to the Royal Academy, is I'd really like to know, all of these statues are displayed at the Royal Academy before they're sent abroad. And I'd really like to know, you know, they were part of the summer exhibition usually, because they're big, so they're often mounted in the center of Burlington House. And so I'd really like to know a little bit about how they were conceived of as pieces of art, right? Because in some ways, I think once they're installed where they are, people don't think of them so much as pieces of art, and that the tablet or the plinth mainly focuses on the subject of the statue rather than the artist who made it, if that makes sense. Well, but it's a good question. I wish I knew. There's this wonderful book by Laura Jane Smith. I don't know if any of you read it. She did these surveys about people visiting historic houses in England and about what they perceived, right? And I think her idea was like, well, what do you know, Black and Asian folk think when they visit historic houses in England? And the surveys are just so inconclusive. I mean, it seems like most people go to these historic houses because they just want a day out, right? So that actually the thing that makes people like us go to those historic houses are not what makes the, you know, quote unquote ordinary public go.
Yes, Marianne, you have a question as well.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed what you said about the moving statues across the empire and everything really. And it made me think about Kala Ghoda in Mumbai.
Yeah.
And I just, because you talked about horses, and because there's a statue of a black horse which gives its name to the area, but Edward VII
It's that statue.
Yeah, on the horse. And I don't know exactly when they decided to just keep the horse and get rid of of the Prince of Wales. But I just wondered if this if this were a strategy that was used elsewhere across former colonies, or is it just one of a kind, or I just wondered about that. And I had another question, but it's larger, and I'm not sure there are colonial statues involved, but I was wondering about the Central Vista project in Delhi.
Oh, right.
But it's a big question, but about how they deal with colonial heritage in this project of redevelopment. But it's just a thought, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about both of those things. So the Kala Gora project is it's a neighborhood in Bombay, and they had one of these equestrian statues of Edward VII. Actually, I think it's by McKennell, so it's the same architect. I'm gonna write about it in the book, but I'll tell you really quickly to historicize it. So Edward is very important to the city of Bombay because he inaugurates the gateway to India, right? So he has this royal tour in 1876, 1877, when Victoria is crowned Empress of India. And he's sent away for a long time, like 2 years or something. Anyway, he goes to lots of places, but India is one of them. Toronto is another one of them. And the statue that's installed in Delhi after he's died ends up in Toronto in 1969 at the 150th the sesquicentennial celebrations of the founding of the Dominions of Canada. So, but the statue that's in Bombay, and in fact, a lot of these statues, Edward dies in 1910, I think 1911 maybe, and these statues are commissioned in the various places in which he visited, often by private benefactors. So it's not the government that's commissioning them. Often it's like supporters of Edward. And in the euphemism of the day, it sounds like he was kind of a bon vivant. He was a party animal and he was very welcoming and so on and so forth. A lot of those statues are commissioned in the early teens. And then when the war happens, there's a shortage of metal. So there's not enough metal for the statues to be made, right? As we all know, the war changes Britain's place in the world, but it also changes Britain's relationship with its colonies. And so the statue that's in Bombay, the statue that's installed in Delhi, they're all installed after the war. That's why that statue is erected in London in 1921, right? What's interesting about the story of Delhi, or the statue in Delhi, is actually the city of Lutyens, Delhi, has not been built yet in 1921. It's just being started. So the city is not completed until 1931, even though it's the capital city of British India. But the city in the monumental form that we now know it, actually doesn't exist in 1921 when the statue is unveiled. The Bombay statue is unveiled also sometime in the 1920s. It becomes a kind of hub or a colony, but Bombay in Maharashtra, of course, has a very strong Shiv Sena starting in the 70s onward, and in part motivated by the Shiv Sena. I think first the monument is stolen and taken away, right? So I think the idea is nobody really knows where that monument went, but instead they replicate the monument in just the horse. Now the horse has been installed, I think, for about 5 years. So that has not happened anywhere, right? Where a monument goes missing like that. My suspicion is it's been melted down and remade into this horse, but nobody reports it in that way, right? The central government has never done any investigation or made any claims about it. And I think in some ways it falls into that space of, this is a monument, do we really care about it? but obviously some people cared about it enough to remove Edward from I think in some ways, the clever thing about that monument is that it's a space that's been reappropriated and absorbed into how Indians experience that neighborhood, right? And so I actually think it's probably an appropriate use of a colonial monument, right? That the monument itself is not so important as the spaces that it occupies and how they're used, right? But I don't see that happening in a lot of cities. I will just say, I'll talk about in the book, I'm going to focus on the Victoria Memorial, which is in Calcutta. And that's another one of these monuments that actually isn't completed, I think, until 1926, by which time there are mass nationalist protests everywhere, right? And, oh, sorry, the other thing I forgot to tell you is that when these monuments are all unveiled in 1921-22, another Prince of Wales goes out for a royal tour to unveil them. And it's at the height of the non-cooperation movement. So the royal tour here is intended to cover up for the fact that most Indians are rebelling against the British. And so the statues then become a kind of political tool, right, to showcase a kind of permanence that in fact is not permanent, right? So it's a very good question. And then just the new vista. I mean, I think it's a fascinating, I've been following the debates about the Modi government. It's horrifying, right? Because the archives are being totally packed up and moved, and everyone, I think, is expecting the worst. The fascinating thing about New Delhi is that it's actually a really new city, right? And in fact, it's only really fully up and running for about 15 years before the British have to leave India, right? So as a city, it's a kind of interesting space, and there's some good work being done about how the city is populated when India becomes independent and Delhi becomes the capital of post-colonial India. What's fascinating is the road renamings is a huge task for the Delhi Municipal Commission. And the Delhi municipality is very actively invested in thinking about these heritage sites as heritage sites. And maybe I'll just offer one kind of slightly wonky thing. One of the things that happens in the city of Delhi, of course, there's a lot of archaeological sites that are considered protected under the British, but the new sites are not considered protected until the 1970s. And in part, that's because the Indian government does not want to do what the Modi government is doing. The Indian government at that point says, this is our city, we're going to own it the way it is, right? So there isn't actually for 70 years an effort to remake the city as an Indian city. So I think this thing that Modi's doing for someone who's a conservative politician is actually pretty dramatically new, which I mean, I think it's a waste, right? I don't think it had to be that way. I think it wrongly makes Delhi into a colonial city when I don't actually think it makes New Delhi into a colonial city when I don't actually think it was a colonial city, right? Like, I think it's only the capital it's the capital since 1911, right? But that's what, a generation until India becomes independent, right? The city, and the way it looks right now, is only completed in 1930, right? And it's formally opened in 1931. So I think this business of remaking the city is a little silly, right? Or the logic of stamping out colonialism somehow in this spatial and visual way is a little, it's historically wrong, right? Is the way I would say it.
Thank you very much. I might have just one last question, if that's
Sure.
okay, Durba. We can see the sun rising in your window in the
Well, and I
background.
realize you all are missing your lunch, so you must be starving. So.
Just one quick question concerning the statues traveling to Ireland. Are you going to be looking into the dates? Because you mentioned the 1950s in Dublin. So I'm not.
There's one. There's the one that moves.
That's intriguing.
Florence one moves in 1957. There's two more that move in the late 60s that I'm going to be looking at. And part, again, this is This is like provided we can all travel, right? I'd really just love to see how the ones that travel in the 60s are actually supported by their local government. So the Lawrence statue is moved because the alumni of the school that it's moved to raise the funds to move it, and they persuade the P&O to give them free shipping. So then the task of installing the statue isn't that expensive. Another feature of what I'll talk about in the book is they're publicly, when they're unveiled, it's a very public unveiling, but when they're removed, it's very private, and they move secretly. They're kind of spirited away on a train, taken to Bombay, put on a ship, and everybody says we have to keep it secret. Nobody can know that we're moving this monument. In the 60s, the government of Ireland chips in the money. And I do kind of want to work through why the government of Ireland decides that that's something it needs to do. So I think one of the things that is maybe a little arcane, most of the time the government does not want to get into the business of putting up statues and maintaining them, but there's a lot of pressure put on them by private associations, often by very prominent individuals saying, I want to see my uncle or my commander or whatever commemorated, and will you please help me? I want to focus. I mean, the reason I think Northern Ireland is so important, it's because actually Mountbatten unveils them too. That's the other thing. So Mountbatten, who's the final viceroy, ends up unveiling not this Lawrence statue, but another statue in Northern Ireland, right? So it's very clearly tying this movement of statues to this empire. And really after the 50s, it's an empire that is supposed to be over, right? But the statues live on, right?
Yes, thanks very much. If there are no other questions, I think we might now wrap up by saying that this was really, really fascinating in terms of looking into these ideologies of permanence, and of course maybe some delusion about that whole question of permanence, which was meant to be set in stone and in metal, and yet of course, as you've shown, was much more fluid than that, and that whole question of entering a more fluid conception of these relationships and the ways that cities also express those ideologies was made so clear by you. So we're extremely grateful, Durba. We're very much looking forward to holding that book in our hands and being able to read it when it eventually comes out. So I hope you'll keep us posted as to the developments, and of course, if you come to Europe, you're more than welcome to come and visit us in France. If there's any research you might like to do around Paris, we'd love to take a tour with you of our monuments here.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for the questions. They always move me along, but thank you all for giving up your lunch on a Friday.
Problem at all. Maybe we would like to thank you very much, and maybe we would like to announce the next session of the webinar. Yes. So it'd be on the 23rd of May, and it'll be happening on a hybrid basis, since the session will actually take place at Université Paris-Cité and simultaneously on Zoom. And it will be conducted by Florence Binard from the University of Paris-Cité and Rashmi Varma from the University of Warwick, who is a member of the Feminist Dissent Network. And the title of that joint presentation will be Communitarianism versus Women's Fundamental Rights, Comparative Perspective, Britain and France. So there'll be a lot to be said, I'm sure. And we'll hope, we do hope that we'll see, as many of you as possible then, right? So many thanks. And as usual, the recording of this session, just like the recording of the previous sessions, will be shortly available on the Medid blog, right? Thanks a lot.
We usually do it very quickly. Please give us a bit of time. Perhaps next week might be a little slower than usual, but it will be online without too much delay. We promise. Yes. So
thanks.
So much again to Durba and to Charlotte.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.